Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3, top of page 1240. Aleph Reish Mem. Okay. So we finished the paragraph where we discussed that just as it is in Ratzon HaTachten, the Ratzon that, what he calls the Ratzon that is driven by Seichel. So there's the concept of a Heskem, which is essentially what is defined as the Ratzon below Seichel, because the Seichel has receded in the background. We've forgotten the logic, so to speak, or it's after the Hisbonenus during davening. So all that remains is the determination. It's a Heskem. But there, what she calls that Metzach of Z'A, that's the forehead of the level of Z'A, and the conscious faculties, the conscious emotions. So there, it's an actual concealment. After davening, or when you're not, or you don't remember the reasoning, you just are committed to it and determined to do what you're committed to, you actually don't feel that the seichel within it. On the other hand, when it comes to Ratzon Elyon, which he defines as a Ratzon that's not al pitas, and that too has a concealed element of midas and seichel, tam komus, called arich ampin. And then it has a deeper level of chachmas tima that's fundamentally removed. That's what's called heskem. There, the reason it's called a heskem is not because it's concealed in that very level, because it's concealed from us, from those outside of arich ampin. So the Metzach of Atik, which is clearly the same thing as the Metzach of Arich, I would actually call it the Metzach, the forehead of Arich Ampin. In contrast to the forehead of Zohar Ampin, is different in their Heskem. They both, there's a concealment where you don't know the reasoning behind it, and all you have is the determination. But the difference is, as we learned in the end of the paragraph, is that in Zohar, in Ratzon HaTachten, it's an actual concealment. The individual himself, let's talk about a human being, does not know what the reason behind it. They only have the determination. Whereas when you talk about Ratzon Elyon, that level itself, it's not concealed from the level of Arich Ampin, but it's concealed from everything outside of that. The lower levels of consciousness, we cannot fathom and understand at all the reasoning behind, like shtek kachola b'machshava, like this barbaric behavior, treatment of Rabbi Akiva, the example that he gave. So that's the distinction. But both of them have something in common, that there's a heskem. So why is it called Metzach? Remember, we said Metzach is because it conceals the intelligence within the mind. He said that clearly in the bottom of page 1237. He says, why is it called Metzach? So the concealment of Metzach of Z'A is very different than the concealment of Metzach of Arich. Now, I did a little more research and learning more than my morim where this is based on. I think I mentioned this, but I'll mention it again. Now I really looked into it more in depth. This whole section is based on a mimer, Vasisa Tzitz. That was the tzitz I mentioned yesterday, the headband that Aaron the Kohen was commanded to, was one of his garments. And that tzitz was al Metzach Aaron. It was placed on the forehead. So this mimer, which is a mimer that the Alter Rebbe said in the year Pesach, the first day of Pesach, Tov Kuf Samach Vav. You want to know the exact date. So the Mittler Rebbe wrote down this mimer. We only have the Mittler Rebbe's Hanoch. I think maybe I think only the Mittler Rebbe's Hanoch. It's printed in a sefer called Teres Chaim. Teres Chaim is a sefer of Maimorim of the Mittler Rebbe that were published by the Mittler Rebbe in his time, in Parsha Tetzava. And then the Tzemach Tzedek took that Maimer and added gloss and footnotes to it, or notes, I should say, not footnotes, notes. And that's printed in Eira Teira, if you want to look it up, Tetzava, page, what is it, 1717 and on. So I looked into the more details of it, and it's very clear there, when you learn that, a lot of ideas that are spoken here become clear because there's a lot more background there. The Rebbe Rashab chose only selections from that mimer, didn't bring everything. But when you look there, it becomes a lot clearer. So a lot of some of my own confusions and not clarity is clear there. So we're definitely talking about Metzach Arich Ampin and Zoyer Ampin, which are they are essentially two dimensions. One is called the long face. That's what Arich Ampin means, long. Ampin is a face. And Zoyer Ampin is the small face. Now, what does it mean by long and small? Obviously, it doesn't mean physically. It means one is a far more developed and unlimited state, but it's still a face. It's a structure. That's what Ampin means. If you remember, we talked about the looking at the face. The whole thing began on the top of page 1237 that Abba ve'ima mistaklim b'mitzcha da'arich Ampin. So when you think of a face has many elements to it. A face has eyes, a nose, a mouth, ears, and a forehead. Within the face, there's the skull, that's called Galgalta, and part of the Galgalta is the Metzach, the forehead. So this is somewhat discussed in these Maimarim that the Rebbe Rashab did not specify. But what we're looking at here is that the structure in Seder Ishtalshus, the way God created the structures, Zoyer Ampin is more of a conscious structure, is the structure of emotions, the emotional attributes. Arich Ampin is superconscious structure, but there's a structure there. And that's what he calls Rotzen Tacht and Rotzen Elyon. Now, the focus on Rotzen is Metzach, because when you talk about the eyes, the ears, or especially the intelligence within the skull, beneath the forehead, intelligence is not called Rotzen. That's already a Gilui. That's called Chachma Bina Das. So on the Rotzen Tachten, the Chachma Bina Das, when it's radiating, we won't call that the level of Metzach. That will not be called the level of forehead. That will be called Moichin Glim. He says that explicitly in the Maimarim that I just cited. When is it called Metzach? Is when the Seichel is concealed and all you have is the Rotzen, the determination. The same thing in Rotzen Elyon. In the Rotzen Elyon, the superconscious state, there's also a structure. But there, as we said, the structure is concealed because there the Moichin and the Midas are higher than Seichel. They're not than Seichel in conscious intelligence. We're talking now how they are in the level of Arich Ampin. So there too, there's a level where there's a Gilui, which is called Gilui to itself, because we said it's Turei, the Cheshecha, it's hidden and concealed within the Rotzen. Then there's, when the Rotzen itself is dominant, that's Kachola b'machshava. So the concealment is from the lower levels cannot fathom, and it defies logic, their logic, to understand the machshava or the tam v'das that exists on that higher level. But there's also that level of determination, which is the heskim, as he called it, which is higher than the tam komus, which is still a reason that we could relate to some extent, a complete determination, but it's concealed from us, and that's why it's called Metzach, the forehead. So therefore, now we have, in contrast, two levels of Metzach. Both don't have Seichel in a revealed way, but the concealment of the Seichel is very different. One is from the level itself, and one is only compared to those outside of that level. I mean, to use a simple example, when a brilliant teacher is teaching, and he conceals something from the student, meaning he doesn't reveal everything he knows, the concealment is only from the point of view of the student. The teacher is not concealed by the teacher. The teacher remains, the ideas remain intact by the teacher. He's just not expressing them. But then there's a level where in the student, for example, that the student itself, the student could also forget what he learned. He only knows the conclusion. And that concealment is a real concealment from the point of view of the student, not just relative to what's outside of the student. So that would be an example, another example to explain the difference between the two concealments that he just described and discussed. Now it's interesting, I'm still not finished reading all the whole Maimer. It's a pretty long Maimer and so on, but I think he touches upon some other questions that came up in our discussion, namely the idea of what does it mean that there's two levels of Chachmas Tima? Because we were talking yesterday about the lower level of Chachmas Tima, is it privy to the higher level? And in general, if we're talking about it as complete, that it's not concealed from the level of Chachma, So what does it mean, the two levels? So the Tzemach Tzedek seems to touch upon this, but I didn't really finish studying it properly. So I don't want to comment until I look it through more in depth. At the end of the Maimer, he talks about it at length, well, relatively at length. But bottom line is that, to go back to what we, just to conclude, what we've been learning here, when he said that there is in the Ratzon HaElyon, there's a Heskem, as he said, it's not akshus, there's a reason, but the reason is completely concealed. As if there's nothing, as if there's no reason at all. Okay. So with that, we conclude the top of page 1240. If anybody wants to ask anything, I'll be happy to answer any questions on this. And remember, we're still in the middle of talking about the subject, so the next paragraph is continuing the theme. So it's not over yet, but at least some clarity so far what we've discussed.
But this is like you said, you didn't finalize it. Yesterday you brought up the idea of how about the midos of Arichanpin. If the Gilui, the Heskem is coming to the midos also, or it's not coming to the midos. Because the midos is Nisgale to Atzilus. But the Heskem, your question that you brought yesterday, if the Heskem, it's Meir in Arichanpin. But the question was, if it's Meir also in the midos. And this is said just now that you didn't conclude.
No, I said yesterday, and I say again, my answer, my leaning would be yes, that it is Meir. He doesn't explicitly state it, so I don't want to say 100%, but based on what it says here, what he says that an Arichanpin is Meir the Oyer, and the Etzem Oyer, like he says, the Etzem, Atzmis Chachmis Tima, and the Rotzen, the Etzem HaRotzen. So my answer would be that yes, in Arichanpin, in its midas and in its seichel, it is radiating. That's why we don't call it Shtei Kachol Machshav is only Legaba Chachmi Lav Atzilus Moshe Rabbeinu, not Legaba Arichanpin. So I would answer yes. The answer is that it is Begili there. But remember, that Gilui is a Helam from us. So it doesn't change that fact. It's still concealed from us. But in the level of Arichanpin itself, my answer would be yes. As a matter of fact, I'm ready to even say it conclusively. Now that I read it again, it seems very clear.
Yeah. It's concealed for us, but this is already a mockery for the Atzilus.
Well, not so poshut, because we're talking about the higher level in Arichanpin, not the lower level, not Pnimius. We're talking about Pnimius Arichanpin, not Chitzenius Arichanpin. So Pnimius Arichanpin radiates in their attic, and that always remains removed from us. Chitzenius Arichanpin is Tam Komos. That's a reason we can relate to, and there's some glimpse of it. So it doesn't really change that fact, because Pnimius Arichanpin, where Shtei Kachol Machshava is be'etzem mechusa, be'etzem concealed from us.
So you say that the midas is also the Pnimius? The midas is not the Pnimius?
Even if the midas are not the Pnimius, but as I said to you, in Arichanpin is radiating this level, that we know. The question is if it's radiating also in Chitzenius Arichanpin, that I can't say for sure. So on the top of page 1240, it's mashme when he says Zeu Dafke b'Bchinas ha'Pnimius the Arichanpin. The Bchinas hu b'Bchinas Helam l'gabe Natzom, alo ba'Arichanpin atzmei meir ha'er b'Gili. So the question is how you interpret that last two lines. How do you explain that? You could say it means that Dafke Pnimius Arichanpin, which is a Helam l'gabe Natzolim, but an Arichanpin itself, meaning even Chitzenius Arichanpin is also radiating Pnimius Arichanpin. You could say that way, or you could touch it differently. That's what I'm saying. It's not so definitive here. What I'm ready to say, I should quell is that an arich is definitely radiating this level. He says it clearly. Now, my assumption is that if it's radiating an arich ampin, then you have the midas and the moichin of arich ampin. That's what it means. Because an arich ampin, it's not a helam. It's not steak kachol b'machshava. So that's what it means, that the moichin of arich ampin can appreciate this heskem of that's on that level. Chochmah d'Atzilus, Chochmah love d'Atzilus cannot. It's concealed. That's what Pashas, what means the moichin and the midas of arich ampin, that they can experience that higher superconscious level. So when you say there's a heskem, you're saying, we're referring to that there's a level of arich ampin that we can relate to, tam komus, a reason that we could relate to, and then there's a level of arich ampin that's shtick. But this is all legaba us, not legaba arich ampin itself. So in other words, arich ampin has two dimensions. One is a tam komus, that which is relatable and accessible to Chochmah d'Atzilus and the Severities of Atzilus, and one is a tam that, not a tam, I should say, a heskem that's completely removed. But it's not legaba arich, it's legaba us. That's how he explains this piece. So in other words, when we say, for example, in Z'A, you have two dimensions. One is that the midas and the rotzen feels the seichel behind it. In other words, all the reasons that you come to in your contemplation of why you should want to be close to God, it's all radiating. So we don't call that Metzach. We don't call that Metzach. We call that rotzen. We don't call that rotzen and Metzach. We call that moichin. That the moichin are revealed in the rotzen and in the midas. Then there's a level in Z'A. We're talking about Z'A, that's Metzach of Z'A. There, the moichin and midas are concealed. Well, the moichin is concealed. All that's left is the determination, the rotzen. But that's a real concealment. Z'A, in that point, is not feeling. All it feels is the commitment it made. But it doesn't feel the moichin. In arich, you also have two stages. One is arich, where you have the moichin and midas is radiating that within the rotzen, what he called says, what did he say? Let me just say. Well, doesn't say mamish beferish, but he says that there is moichin and midas, and then there's a heskem. The heskem in arich ampin is the level where the heskem in arich ampin is the level where you only have the shtei kachol machshava, the heskem itself, and completely concealed. The reason is completely concealed, but this concealment is from us, not from arich. That's what he says. Okay.
Simon, he's saying מבחינת מידס דאריך אנפין ובחינת הטעם הקומוס, הרי זה בכל מקום מבחינת גילוי לגבי הנאצולים. He's not saying it לגבי מויך von אריך אנפין, only לגבי מידס דאריך אנפין. מויכים maybe are not גילוי לגבי הנאצולים.
That I don't know. I'm not sure, but I would think that since there's midas and midas are nailed from the moichin, maybe. But remember, he did say the chochmas t'ma. That's not correct. No, chochmas t'ma is moichin, and the lower level we do have some glimpse. Read on. He says, if you read on, he says, "Chetzenis chochma mashal mamza makom mokim efek tzeiv bali degili." Also moichin, he says that.
But if you're looking here about 10 lines from the bottom, in page,
yeah, but 1 second, he's not. It's not a contradiction. He says there's also in moichin chochmas t'ma, the lower level of chochmas t'ma. You efes katsei boile de gili v'yesh mezem madregas gaveya avol b'chinas and chochmas. It's not a steer. On the bottom, he's not going into the details. He already said it. He doesn't have to repeat it. One second, let me just look at it again. Oh, 1 second. He says, midas the arich ampin ubchinas hatam komos. Tam komos is chochma, is meichin. Tam. He says both. Harizem mekomok and b'chinas gili. Okay? Even what you're quoting below, he says two things, midas and tam komos. Tam komos is the lower level of chochmas t'ma. So part of that, yes, is revealed. Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions? Anybody?
Yes, when you said Metzach of Z'A, and you gave the mashal, I think your mashal was referring to that level of a student that learns something, then he has his determination, and then you use the term, and he forgets the seichel behind it. Is that a prerequisite to forget it, or could you have Metzach of Z'A with the seichel receding into the background, but he didn't forget it? It's still there.
By the way, I didn't. The example of forgetting, the Rebbe Rashab said at the bottom of 1239. That's part of this mimer, the forgetting. No, it's not. Well, let me answer that in two details that I would mention about that. Number one, he's talking about a level. He's not saying that's a prerequisite. It's just what happens. It's like when a person is davening, they're engulfed in the flames and passion of their contemplation, and everything is alive. And after davening, the seichel, the hisbananus recedes and is forgotten, passes, and what remains is the determination, like the psak. Some of them, one mimer says it's like the psak din remains, even if you don't know all the reasons behind it. The second thing he did say, at the bottom of 1239, he did say that when you only have the determination, in some ways, it's much more unwavering and firmer, even more than when you have the seichel. Because seichel is subject to changes. He says that at the bottom of 1239, just for the record. So I would say that it's not really relevant to our longer discussion, these two options I just said. The bottom line is there is a state. Yes, you could have a state of having the seichel and also the determination. Ratzon is not a contradiction. Seichel is not a contradiction to Ratzon, but it does say in this mimer that seichel can conceal sometimes. And let's put it this way. The foot soldiers that don't understand all the strategy and march with Mesiras Nefesh have a certain quality over the generals and the sergeants and the ministers who understand the strategy, because their understanding gives them a lot more giluyim, but they don't have the atzmi is not shining as much. So in a certain way, pure determination without the seichel has that milas, like the mila of Oish Pashat, if you're asking the question. But here he's also talking about it, not necessarily always a mile. It also is only metzach, as in the giluyim of moichin is not there. So it depends what you're talking about. If you want giluyim, yeah, that's what it seems like he's saying here. So there is an advantage of determination without seichel. He does say that at the bottom of 1239. Yeah. Okay, good. Moving on. Any other questions, comments? Okay. So I'm now reading the new paragraph at top of page 1240. This can be found at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow along the text. And here we go. So on this infinite journey on Mount Everest, we're moving to the next peg. You know, you need to have, when you're climbing a mountain, you need the pegs to hold on to, or else we can completely lose our footing.
You have a good safety net. You have a good safety net.
Yeah. I'm not worried at all. The worst is we don't understand it, and we just come overwhelmed. It's not so bad. It's not terrible.
You know, Rabbi Jacobson, in that mashal that we always use, that you always use about climbing Mount Everest, I was trying to explain Ayin Beis to somebody yesterday, and it seemed to me that maybe a more appropriate one is not climbing the mountain, because you're going higher and higher. But I was trying to say that Ayin Beis allows you to have the deepest relationship with God that can permeate all your levels of machshava, dibur, maisa, and emotion. You know, emotionally. So it could be not climbing the mountain, but digging deep into the, to the Yam HaMelech, deep into the depths, and so you can deepen your relationship with God, rather than a mountain seems to be away far from you. I don't know. It just seems to deep the relationship. When you always say you want a deep relationship with somebody, you don't want a high relationship with somebody, which would be Mount Everest. I don't know. It's just a thought I had, and I just wanted your reaction to it.
It's perfectly fine. I accept that. That's just my own. By me, maybe it's two things. That depends on the gavra or the chefza. If you're talking about the chefza, then you're right. if you're talking about from our point of view, when you're learning this, it feels like we're like hanging on this mountain and we're too low, we're too high to go down, and we're too low to go up. We're like, so I totally accept what you say. No issue. I also have another imagery. Both is true. And I would also add another analogy, which is relentless waves. In the ocean, it never stops. I feel like a certain relentlessness in a good way. The Rebbe Rashab just is pouring it on, like he doesn't stop. There's no end to this. Like a mimer, you look at the pages, you count, okay, 10 pages to go, 5 pages to go. Here, it's just like middle of an ocean. It's beautiful. I love it. What can I tell you? If I feel the real analogy for me is like a child in its mother's womb. I think we're like being encompassed here in this bleak wool, like infinite power. And we're just little creatures allowed into there. We're like being submerged in it and nurtured and covered and protected and everything else. That's how I feel, really. Like a little thing inside of maybe like the 10 hidden spheres as they're encompassed in Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum or something.
The endless ways the endless ways analogy does that bring you back to Far Rockaway? Or where was it that that time out there when you went out there?
No pun intended. It wasn't Far Rockaway. It was Rockaway.
It was Rockaway.
It wasn't far. It was very close. Yes. Whenever you experience, when you experience the humility of being, and I'm not saying this in a humorous way, that the idea that we can go back into the womb of our creation, our genesis, that pure moment when we just began, like the Big Bang, the moment that the cell, the egg was fertilized and a life began, is a very pure moment. It's like going into Seder Shtalshlus all the way back to the original primordial states. And I think when you learn Chassidus properly, it has an element of that. It takes you out of the grime and the pollution and the toxins of our lives and the world around us. And it brings us back into a very pure place where you are like surrounded, like in the water, like a mikveh. Me hadas atar. The world filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. It's something very purifying to feel like you're not just learning. It's not like just washing your hands and your dry hands are getting wet. Your whole being, like tefillah from the word bittul, habittul, your whole being is being submerged in a higher conscious, a higher reality. That's really true learning Chassidus. And it changes you because you're within it. Instead of you trying to own it or contain it, you surrender to it and you allow yourself, let me drop myself into the water and let myself be surrounded by these waters of, in this case, the Rebbe Rashab's brilliance and elokus and Ein Sof and all the different words you can use for it. That's ultimately the real experience and my feeling on the matter. All the Mount Everest or the deep, they're all good. No. Okay.
Beautiful.
Back into the water. Let's get back into the water. Okay. And from this will be understood. From this we understand. Gamkein. This we'll also understand. The mitzcha de arich ampen eine beginnes din. K'moy mitzcha de Z'A. That the Metzach, this level of rotzen, determination of arich ampen, is not the level of judgment or severity like the Metzach of Z'A, shehi din, which is a level of judgment. If you remember, the top of page 1238, 2 pages back, he spoke about this. He said, why is Z'A? The Zohar says that in Z'A, Is'arin awaken the severities and the judgments. So he said, because the Moichin is concealed there. And when Moichin is concealed, the Midas become more severe. That's the natural state of the Midas. When the Moichin is there, Moichin by nature is able to be tolerant. And he gave the example of a child. When the moichin is not there, a child gets quickly angry, quickly upset. So Z'A, when it's in a state of Metzach of Z'A, not when the moichin are radiating. When moichin are radiating, even Z'A is also sublimated and tamed. But when you compare Metzach of Z'A to Metzach of Arichampin, here's going to be a key distinction. Even though in both of them the seichel is not revealed, but the Metzach of Z'A, there's din mipnei she'era seichel v'chachmu sham b'bchinas katnus v'tzimtzum b'yeser. As we said before, canal. As we learned before, because there the era seichel v'chachma in the Metzach level has receded, and it's in a state of katnus, either immature or not developed, v'tzimtzum b'yeser, and increasingly diminished or concealed or contracted, whatever the word you want to, however you translate. I like concealed, canal. So there, din is powerful until, so there's two ways that you can, we'll learn about it, but let me just say it just to give it clarity. There's two ways that those dinim, those severities of Z'A can be tamed or can be smoothed out, if you wish, can be, let's use the word you use, nullified or channeled or harnessed, nullified. One is if the moichin is radiating there. So moichin by nature curb and control the midas. But the second way, that even if you don't have moichin, the metzach of, if the metzach of arich is radiating, like by Eis Rotzen, Raiva Deraiva, we're going to learn, that also has the power to mitigate and to nullify the severities of the Metzach of Z'A. That's the Zohar that we began this whole discussion back on top of page 1237. So just keep that in mind. But right now he's going to explain the difference between the Metzach of Arich, Ampin, and the Metzach of Z'A. And it's based on, from what we said, Mizeh Yuvan, because there's a difference between them. So we just said that, okay, so the Metzach of Z'A, there's din, the Metzach of Arich Ampin, Eina Bechin is din, like the Metzach of Z'A. He didn't explain yet, so let's just go on. V'oid, and additionally, or furthermore, or moreover, Sha'aratzen atachten kiven shenelim b'chinas chochma bina. This is a whole piece from the Tzemach Tzedek that he added to the Mittler Rebbe's Hanacha of the Alter Rebbe's Maimer. So he's giving another reason. There's two reasons why the Metzach of Z'A is din. Number one, because when the moichin is not there, like you see, why can't a child, for example, be a dayan, a judge, or someone that can bear witness properly? Because a child's emotions are dominant, as we learned earlier, and their judgment, and when I say judgment, I don't mean judgment as in judgments, but I mean their way of their discretion and their judgment calls are not yet mature enough. When somebody is still in an emotional state, they can still have a tantrum, and generally speaking, their emotions are very quickly impacted because the moichin is not developed. A mature mind is someone that can hear something, even though that's disagreeable or something you don't like, but you're not going to go crazy. You're going to listen, and then you can listen to another opinion. Now, the fact that you see adults that can't do that is because they're immature. Because even though chronologically they're adults, but their minds and their emotions can still be of a child. We're talking about a true adult. A true adult is someone whose mind has that balance and is able to tolerate and contain many different opinions, even ones that are not yours. So therefore, dinin and gvuris, judgment, is therefore either nullified completely or at least tamed. Now, I know you'll say, what about people who are very judgmental? From a Torah point of view, Chassidus point of view, they're lacking maturity if they're very judgmental. What means maturity? Not that they're not mature and that they can't make money and they can't run things and be responsible, but they're lacking a certain maturity because they're allowing their opinions to not leave room for any other opinion. And the sign of moichin is a certain element of tolerance. And I say tolerance doesn't mean you have to agree with someone else, but tolerance that you don't let the emotions just take over and you just yell at somebody or you just judge them. How do you know what their situation is? Moichin reflects It's much more, it's kinder and it's gentler and so on. So now he's going to say that's the first reason. V'oid, another element why in Ratzon HaTachton, which would be Z'A. Kiven shenelu b'chinas chachma bina. Since this Ratzon HaTachton, this lower desire, will, we said is what? Is born from a contemplation. It's born from chachma bina. Chachma itself also has a measure of din. Not din as in the judgmentalism of a child. Not like that. Not someone who's not reflective or quick to come to a conclusion, emotional conclusion. Din meaning discretion. That it has discretion. Who? And he's explaining. Who? So below they write. Let me just see how the Tzemach Tzedek writes it. They corrected below, but I want to see the Tzemach Tzedek's way of writing this. Hold on. What did I say? Aleph Tavshin Yud Zayin? Yeah. Liyes Kefi. It says, Hu sheyesh kefi chiyuv. The Tzemach Tzedek writes, Liyes kefi chiyuv. Below they wrote Shiur. Okay. The bottom line, so what's the din, the little din, that the certain measure of din that's in Chachma? He says, V'hu, I'll use the Tzemach Tzedek's language. Liyes, she'u liyes kefi chiyuv ha'seichel dafke. Shezeh b'chinas din or b'chinas gvul. Let me explain. Let me translate it first. That seichel is demands or that you should follow the compelling case that the seichel made, which is a element of din and gvul. So din has several elements to it. Din could be judgment, as in judging someone, or din could be severity. But there's another element in din is discretion and a specific type of approach. So seichel has an element of din in it because when a person comes to a conclusion based on a logical argument, so that logical argument compels that you should follow what the argument stated. We're not getting into the emotions right now. The seichel itself, the chachma itself, has an element of saying of din and gvul, that before you use your chachma, it could have gone different directions. No, let's say you're standing before a rav, a rabbi, or before a judge, or anyone that's going to listen to arguments. So before the arguments are presented, you can have many different approaches. Then this person deliberates on it with seichel. We're talking about objective deliberation, objective analysis, evaluation, and all that. And then they come to a conclusion that this and this is the way it is, or should be. So the element of din is the conclusion of the logical process. So therefore, since Ratzon HaTachton is based on Chachma Bina, on Seichel, and Seichel itself, like he says, Chachma, Atzma, Yesh Bo K'tzas Din, that din, because Seichel determined, I don't want to say the word determined differently than determination of Ratzon, came to a conclusion of a certain approach, so it has an element of din and gvul. So therefore, since the Ratzon HaTachton comes from that, it also will have an element of din. Because let's go sheftim v'shetrim. The judges have ruled, according to the chiyuv ha-seichel, that it should be, this person is, let's say, innocent, the seichel is included, then that's implemented in the emotions. The emotions say, okay, that's the case. This person deserves chesed and kindness. So there you have an element of din. Not din necessarily as in a negative, a din could also be a positive. Or the other way around, the seichel is mechayev that this person is guilty. So therefore they deserve certain discipline. So there you have Meichen and Midas, the Ratzon HaTachton, which is driven by seichel, that it has an element of din in it, which is what I would use the word discretion here. Discretion, I don't like the word judgment here, it'd be more discretion, definition, specific direction. So, but now comes the question, doesn't this seem to contradict what we just said before? We said someone with Meichen, when the Meichen is radiating, there's no dinim gvura. So the Rebbe Rashab is going to continue. This is all from the Tzemach Tzedek. I can tell you what page. If you guys want, I could photo it and you could look it up. And if you don't have the sefer,
I would appreciate that if you don't mind.
Anyway, what I'm reading right now is page 1720 in Eira Torah Tetzav. I'll do it afterwards. Okay. So what does he say? He says, Rak shemakol mokim, however, nevertheless, mepnei rechev hachachma, because even though chachma has discretion, chachma is not just ambiguous and goes in every direction. It does have like he says, chiyuv haseichel, a certain way to do al pi chiyuv haseichel, according to what the seichel concluded, the case the seichel made. Because of the expansiveness of wisdom, sevel gamma hefech, it tolerates and can accept also the opposite. In other words, let's just argument's sake say you have three judges sitting in a bezdin, court of law. They hear arguments, evidence, witnesses, and so on. One of them comes to the conclusion the person is innocent, or the money belongs to this person, not to this person, whatever the argument's about. A second judge comes and says, no, I think the evidence shows the other way around, that the other person, it belongs to the other person, or this person is guilty and not innocent. So though the first judge came to chiyuv haseichel and it compels him to this conclusion, but being a chacham, he doesn't get angry at the other judge. He's tolerant. I understand you have a different approach. It's not an emotional thing. It's not like immaturity where, no, my way or the highway. You have to agree with me. So it's true that seichel has an element chachma of din, because it does have, this person has a strong opinion now. But at the same time, it's not in an immature state where you have no tolerance at all. Whereas once the seichel is gone, then both things come into play. Since it was born from seichel, which has a measure of discretion, and now you don't have the seichel there dominating to tame it and keep it unemotional and non-judgmental and not severe, that's when Z'A becomes just the Ratzon, the Metzach of Z'A will have din in it. That's what he's going to say. And that's why, so then when the Chachma is removed, recedes, in the background, it's no longer shining and radiating, and all you have is the conclusion, is the determination, had is a din. That's din. So the Tzemach Tzedek, when the Rebbe Rasha brings both, two aspects, in other words, that make Z'A din. One is merely the fact that it doesn't have moichin there that tolerates and is more, let's call it coexistent, cooperative, looking for the right words, maturity. And the second thing is because also seichel does have a measure of din, except when the seichel is there, it keeps it at bay and is able to tolerate. Remove the seichel, and now Z'A is left with only its raw emotional din and severity. Sharia heskem hanishar, because the determination or the conclusion that remained after the seichel receded, zeu masha chachma v'seichel mechayev sheyiyah. That's the result. Why did you determine this? Because the seichel, the chachma and the seichel, the wisdom and the intelligence, compelled this. So just before we read further, so just to give an example, I'm going back to my example. You have the three judges. One of them has one opinion, the other has another opinion. As long as the seichel is radiating, then they can be best friends. They can agree to disagree. They can even appreciate each other's arguments. It's not like they have to, there's no element of severity here. It's seichel is mechayev, but the seichel is keeping that coexistence or that balance. Let's say you remove the seichel, now all you have is the psak. Now the people who are, let's say, I'm not going to say political, but people who like this Rav say, he paskin so and so, and that's it. The other group likes the other Rav, he paskin the opposite. Now you can have yourself a real machlekes. Why? Because the seichel is not there to keep them balanced. Like someone say, why did he paskin that way? Let's talk about the logic. No. I mean, this, unfortunately, I don't want to use any examples, but I'm sure you can apply this to many situations. where people just take the literal conclusion of a whole series of valuations and thinking process and just become fanatics and zealots about that conclusion. Another party has a different, follows a different conclusion, and they butt heads. There's real severity and judgments. Why? Because they're not using seichel. They're just blindly following. Now, there's a value in the determination, obviously. But if the seichel is not there, so-called, to protect that conclusion, two conclusions can really become, I'm just using it as an example. He doesn't say this at all here directly, but it just helps bring it to life, the idea that that's what's going on. So seichel itself has discretion, but also has balance. The midas Z'A, when the seichel is there, so that it maintains the balance. Take away the seichel and you only have the determination. So first of all, the midas themselves are severe because they don't have the maturity and the taming that, and the seichel itself, the conclusion of it, since you only have the conclusion and you don't have the intelligence behind it, and that's what drives she's just come away. That's what it is. Which is why in halacha, actually, when, for example, a Rav paskins something, and then someone challenges it years later, they say, the reasons don't apply anymore. It's a different situation. So some people will just be obstinate and say, no, he paskin, that's it. A true Rav is going to look it over again and see if it still applies. Obviously, you don't overturn a psak so quickly. Precedent has a lot of value, but it's not a blind commitment. Now, we're not talking about halacha l'Moshe Messinai, things that were given at Torah Shebiksav or Torah Shebal Peh in direct way. We're talking about things that a situation changes and so on. So seichel allows you to look at things. When you don't using seichel, you just say, this is the way it is. You don't realize the nuances and the exceptions and the yetzim and aklal. Now, again, I'm not talking about looking for loopholes. We're talking about using seichel to understand that don't just follow just because this was the psak. We have to, now obviously when you get a psak from a Rav, you have to listen to that, no matter what, unconditionally. Because if not, the law loses all its power. But remember, every halacha has taimi halach. There's the taimi hapsak, there's the reasons. So there's a time, not for the person who was ruled, let's say a Rav ruled for you or against you, that you have to follow. But I'm talking about from the Torah halacha point of view, not the recipient. There, you have to sometimes go back, and seichel has that ability to look at situations and look for those nuances and exceptions and so on, just to drive the point home. So now, I'll stop in a minute for questions, but that's ready. Wow. So he says like this. When you have the expansiveness of intelligence or of wisdom, you have both things. Ha'ir v'achiyuv. You have both the light of the seichel, which is the oir that keeps things balanced and harmonious and mature and so on, and the ha'chiyuv. The chiyuv means what the seichel compelled you to. Al keinu b'chinas his gabrus achsodim v'arachamim. That's why, in that situation where you have the chochmah radiating, so what do you have? What's dominant? The chsodim, the kindness and the compassion. Aval haheskim hu sha'ir nistalik. But the determination, the conclusion is where the oir of the chochmah was nistalik. That was seated, or that was removed. That left. V'nisharak chiyuv ha'seichel. And all that's left is what the seichel compelled, the conclusion of the seichel. Levad, alone. Harizeh b'chinas din. So now you're left with din, because the chsadim and the rachamim that seichel provided has now been receded, so you're left with din. V'zehu inyan Metzach of Z'A. That is the forehead, the Metzach of Z'A. So I'm going to stop learning here. I'm going to continue tomorrow. What about Metzach of Arich? It's going to be a different scenario, different picture. But let me stop here, and have any questions, please.
Yeah, he said in the beginning that the Chochmah and the Seichel itself, the B'chinas Katnus v'Tzimtzum b'Yesel. That means this is something else. Here he's saying that in Chochmah there is Roicha v'Chochmah, but probably there is also a concept of
Katnus v'Tzimtzum b'Yesel is Stalkus HaMeichim. That's what he said on page 1238. So that's the two states. That's where that's symptom is like it's the same thing.
No, he said that the first reason why is it din? Because the seichel and the chokhmah is katnus tzimtzum b'yesel. The seichel and the chokhmah.
Because the seichel is not there. So what you're left with is the raw emotions, like a cotton, that have din and gvura. But then he added a second thing, that seichel itself also has a measure of din. So when your seichel is removed, you have two reasons why the din dominates. That's what he explained here.
I have a question. First of all, the explanations are clear. The question is, why are we using din as a focus of understanding how the faculties are operating, or whether they're radiating, or whether they're behelim, and the implications of that on din. I understand it helps understand it, no question about it. But why are we focusing on whether din is dominating, or whether it can be mediated or perhaps softened? So, for example, we're talking about din Hashem.
Okay, I understand the question. I understand the question.
I mean, and Hashem's din is din. Yeah.
The answer is very straightforward, and it's the context of all the pages here. Number one, just bear in mind that this is all coming to explain the Zohar that talks about that dinim are awakened in Z'A. But to put it in simple psychological terms, what we've been learning in the last, 10, 15 pages, maybe. Can everybody mute?
Rabbi Eliezer, can you please mute?
Okay. The whole discussion of this Maimorim here, in this Hemshech, has been how to grow from behavioral, natural emotions, cognitive emotional, to cognitive, now to even higher levels of refinement, where we actually are able to transform our natural tendencies. In psychological terms, basically, a human being is driven by self-interest. Self-interest and subjectivity is what really can, per se, not a bad thing if it's tamed and it's controlled and guided and refined. Where's the most expression of self-interest is when one person's needs and feelings conflict with another's, and everything that's called dinim and gvuris are the judgmentalism, the critique, the lack of tolerance. You go on, is all captured in dinim v'gvuris. Dinim v'gvuris is not just about that there's judgments. It means there's an immaturity where the emotions are in control and the subjective interests of a person are conflict to other people's subjective interests. That's the root of all problems. The root of every war, of every quarrel, of every fight, of every injustice comes down to that. The lack of tolerance, the inability to appreciate, to respect another. And that's, I believe I explained at length when we learned about mutva, murgish, and muskul. As a child grows, even biologically, and especially as we grow in avodah, the goal is to take your self-interest and guide it, and refine it, and control it, and harness it, and ultimately to transform it. So if you want to define what Z'A is in the context that when it's not under the influence of the mind, even when there's a good determination, but the determination lacking the Oyer and Gili of Seichel has an element of intolerance. And it can be very judgmental. Even people who are very religious people in the name of God can be very intolerant of others when their moichin is not there. Just to use that as an example. So determination, in this case, Metzach of Z'A, has that element. Seichel, on the other hand, as he explains in chapter 9 in Tanya, Seichel is reflective. It's exact antithetical to the impulsive nature of emotions. So as I explained, din v'gvura can mean two things. It can mean judgmentalism as in not tolerant, but it's also the raw emotions Their subjectivity is impulsive. And impulsive can bring to all kinds of things. The Nefesh Elikis resides in the mind, which is reflective. And a reflective mind has chesed and rachamim. It's tolerant, it's accepting. Yes, seichel can lead to a particular conclusion, like he said. But as long as the seichel is radiating, it will be tame, refined, tolerant, accepting, and everything I said before. So that's why it's so vital in understanding this whole process. Now we're going to learn how Metzach of Arich Ampin is very different and how it impacts the Metzach of Z'A. And now we've learned at least that Seichel also impacts Z'A. When you have also not just determination. Look at people who follow blindly Torah and mitzvahs. Mitzvahs are not, they're just mechanical Jews. And they do it beautifully. They determine they're going to follow everything in the law. What's the downside of that? The upside, we know. It's a commitment, total commitment. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned, Seichel can get in the way. The downside, however, is that if it comes to a gray situation, a person like that, if they have a child, for example, who suddenly decides to wander off Yiddishkeit, what do? They only know their determination, so they can't tolerate. They may be nice and kind and love their child and be nice, but since they don't have the full energy that comes with intelligence and the mind, and they just follow law, someone breaks the law, you've gone off the reservation, excommunicated, essentially, or you reject them. Whereas a person who understands and is a broader, like it says, the rachvus hachachme, there's an expansiveness. Yes, I don't like what my child is doing, but I have a mind and I have to think it through and reflect. I'm not just following blind laws. I need to look at this in a broader way and see what's the right thing to do to make it work better. Just as an example. So that's how I would explain.
No, it's extremely helpful. Although it's interesting, the higher you go in your hisbonenus, it seems like the less that seichel matters, because the reasoning is concealed, and so it is what it is. So that seems a little counterintuitive.
What's that? We didn't even get to Metzach of Z'A. I can't even comment on that until we learn that inside. I mean, the higher, we didn't go to the highest. We're talking now Metzach of Z'A and Moichem. We didn't talk yet about the higher levels yet. The Ratzon Elyon is going to come next. That's the next section. The topic isn't finished. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to stop here.